July 11th, 2026, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has entered the war, not as a host nation quietly allowing American aircraft to use its airspace, not as a financial backer providing diplomatic cover for other parties to act, not as a regional observer issuing carefully worded statements of concern. Saudi Arabia has conducted offensive military strikes against IRGC-aligned targets, specifically against the Sana'a International Airport in Yemen, in direct response to the regime's continued operations in the region. The moment MBS called Ali Khamenei the new Hitler of the Middle East several years ago, this outcome was visible to anyone paying attention. What happened today is not a surprise to the Crown Prince. It is the resolution of a conflict he has been building toward, lobbying for, and waiting for since before the first American strike on February 28th. The Islamic Republic spent 4 decades treating Saudi Arabia as an adversary to be surrounded, subverted, and humiliated. It built the Houthi military apparatus in Yemen specifically as a knife pointed at the kingdom's southern border. It used Hezbollah financing and IRGC training to extend its influence across every border Saudi Arabia shares with the arc of its strategic concern. It called the Saudi leadership corrupt and illegitimate. It executed Saudi nationals on Iranian soil. It attacked Saudi oil infrastructure through Houthi proxies, with drones that tracked hundreds of kilometers to reach Aramco processing facilities. It assassinated Saudi diplomats and attempted to assassinate Saudi officials on American soil. And it did all of this while Saudi Arabia was attempting to build a modernization program, diversify its economy, and position the kingdom as a viable 21st century state, rather than a perpetual hostage to the IRGC's regional ambitions. MBS was not wrong when he called the supreme leader the new Hitler of the Middle East. He was describing a strategic reality that the Western diplomatic establishment spent years refusing to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would have required a response that diplomats were not prepared to execute. The Crown Prince was lobbying Trump to hit the IRGC hard before February 28th, when the war began. While Qatar and Pakistan were attempting to mediate and de-escalate, Saudi Arabia was pressing the Americans to not allow the regime to survive this moment. That is not the position of a country that is a passive victim of Iranian aggression. That is the position of a country that has been waiting for an operational window and recognized one when it appeared. That window is now fully open. And Saudi Arabia walked through it today. The war now has a new member, and the IRGC's strategic position, already critical on every axis that matters, has just acquired a dimension it was never fully prepared to manage. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why Saudi Arabia's entry today is not a spontaneous reaction, but the final piece of a strategic architecture months in the making, you need to understand what the ceasefire period was actually for. The Memorandum of Understanding that briefly paused the direct military conflict between the United States and Iran was not a genuine diplomatic breakthrough. It was not evidence of Iranian willingness to negotiate its core strategic positions. It was a strategic pause, used by the United States and its coalition partners to do the one thing that an ongoing open-air campaign against Iran could not accomplish alone: dismantle the proxy network surrounding the Islamic Republic before returning to finish the main operation. While the world's attention was on the ceasefire diplomacy and the nuclear deal negotiations, an entirely different campaign was proceeding beneath the headline level. Hezbollah's military infrastructure in Lebanon was being systematically degraded and dismantled. Hamas in Gaza had been reduced to a fraction of its former military capacity. The IRGC militia networks in Iraq were being rolled up. And the Houthis in Yemen, the IRGC's most active remaining proxy, the force that had been firing ballistic missiles at international shipping in Gulf state territory for over a year, were being positioned for the confrontation that is now unfolding. The ceasefire was the strategic equivalent of clearing the surrounding terrain before the final assault on the objective. The IRGC walked into the negotiating rooms in Versailles and Doha while the walls were being built around it. Today, Saudi Arabia entered the theater and completed the encirclement, and the IRGC is only now fully realizing that the diplomatic phase it thought was its survival strategy was actually the preparation for its termination. The trigger for Saudi Arabia's entry was specific and operationally revealing. An Iranian Mahan Air commercial aircraft took off from Tehran, carrying what are described as a significant number of IRGC members under the cover of a commercial flight to Sana'a International Airport in Yemen. The destination was the Houthi-controlled zone of Yemen, the IRGC's principal remaining proxy theater, where the regime has been using Houthi military infrastructure as an extension of its own military capability for years. Saudi Arabia, with the backing of the Yemeni government, struck the runways at Sana'a International Airport with sufficient precision to prevent the aircraft from landing. The runway was cratered. The aircraft, unable to land at its intended destination, was forced to divert to Houthi. The IRGC members aboard a commercial aircraft, whose presence on that flight demonstrated the regime's continued practice of using civilian aviation as a military transport mechanism, landed at a secondary destination while their intended runway burned. The Houthi entity's nominal foreign minister responded by declaring that Saudi Arabia has started a war and must bear full responsibility for the consequences. The Yemeni government, operating with Saudi backing, responded with its own statement. It has exhausted all diplomatic means to persuade Iran and the Houthis to stop violating Yemeni airspace, has repeatedly urged both parties to cease those violations, and its patience has run out. The armed forces of Yemen have issued formal warnings of severe consequences. The Houthis are now in the position of issuing threats against Saudi Arabia from a country where the Yemeni government has Saudi backing and United States air cover. The IRGC's calculation that Yemen could continue to serve as a forward operating platform for its regional operations has encountered the operational reality of what happens when Saudi Arabia decides it is no longer willing to absorb Houthi provocation as a cost of doing business in the region. And then came Trump's announcement on the Strait of Hormuz, a statement that every analyst in the world should be reading twice, because it does not describe a military operation in the terms that military operations are normally described. The statement reads, "The Strait of Hormuz is open and will remain open with or without Iran. We are reinstating the Iranian blockade, so named because it is only stopping Iran's ships or customers from entering or leaving. All other countries will have fair and open use of the strait. The United States will from this point forward be known as the guardian of the Hormuz Strait, but as such, and as a matter of fairness, will be reimbursed at the rate of 20% on all cargo shipped for any and all costs necessary to do the job of providing safety and security to this very volatile section of the world." Read that statement again, not for its military content, for its commercial architecture. Trump has reframed the American role in the Strait of Hormuz from military enforcer to commercial security provider, and he has attached a fee structure to that role. 20% on all cargo shipped. The United States is not occupying the strait as a strategic gesture of international commitment. It is providing a security service with a billing mechanism. The implication is direct, and the precedent is without parallel in the modern history of international waterways. The world's most critical maritime choke point now has an American security fee attached to it. Every cargo ship that transits under American protection contributes 20 cents on every dollar of cargo value toward the cost of the force that makes the transit possible. This framing is not accidental. It is deliberate recontextualization of the American military role in the region, from geopolitical burden to commercial venture. For decades, American presidents justified the cost of Gulf security operations in terms of strategic interest, alliance obligations, and regional stability. Trump has reframed it as a service rendered for which payment is appropriate and will be collected. The countries that benefit from a secure Strait of Hormuz, every major economy in the world that imports oil, will now contribute to the cost of that security through the cargo levy. The countries that do not pay are countries that must decide whether to send their ships through without the American protective umbrella, which is to say without any realistic security guarantee, given what the IRGC has demonstrated it can do to unprotected vessels. This is not how military blockades work. This is not how strategic deterrence is normally framed. This is a business transaction described in the language of international security, and it transforms the long-term financial calculus of the American military presence in the Gulf in ways that no previous administration would have contemplated, let alone announced publicly as policy. The United States is the guardian of the Hormuz Strait. The guardianship has a price, and the price is structured to generate revenue that offsets the operational cost of maintaining the force that enables commercial transit. Whether international maritime law accommodates this structure is a question for legal scholars. What it accomplishes strategically is the conversion of the American military presence in the Gulf from a cost center to a revenue-generating operation, and the conversion of every cargo ship transiting the strait from a passive beneficiary of American power into a paying customer of it. The IRGC's Persian Gulf Strait Authority, the bureaucratic entity the regime invented during the conflict to assert administrative control over passage through the strait, responded to Trump's announcement with a statement that deserves to be read for exactly what it reveals about the regime's current condition. The PGSA stated, "Due to the recent hostile actions by U.S. forces, passage through the Strait of Hormuz is currently unfeasible. As soon as stability and calm are restored, all applications will be reviewed in accordance with the scheduled timeline and the permitting process will resume." Read that again, carefully. Because what the PGSA is describing is a bureaucratic response to a military reality. The regime created an administrative processing system to manage passage through a strait it does not control and cannot defend, and when that strait was seized by American naval power, it issued a press release explaining that the permitting office is temporarily closed due to instability. The applications queue is suspended. Please reapply when calm is restored. This is the language of an institution that understands it has no military response available and is using procedural language as a substitute for capability. It is, in its own way, the most accurate description of the regime's current strategic position that has been produced by any Iranian government source. They have reduced themselves to issuing bureaucratic statements about a choke point they can no longer control. Now let's talk about the hardware and the operational picture, because the specific capabilities being deployed in this phase of the campaign represent a deliberate expansion into domains the IRGC did not expect to be contested. The United States Central Command released footage of naval attack drones, unmanned surface vessels, sailing directly into IRGC shipyards and destroying the facilities at close range. These are not missile strikes from a carrier deck 50 miles away. These are robotic watercraft sailing into the ports where Iran builds and repairs its naval assets and eliminating those assets at the source. The footage showed unmanned vessels moving toward Iranian harbor infrastructure with no opposition. No Iranian naval response. No detection that produced a defensive action. No sailor at a watch station who saw the incoming vessel and raised an alarm. The IRGC's shipyard facilities were accessible to an unmanned watercraft, which means they were accessible to anything, crewed or uncrewed, armed or intelligence gathering, that chose to enter them. The strategic implication of that footage is larger than the tactical outcome of the individual strike. The IRGC has spent years investing in asymmetric naval capability, fast attack boats, coastal missile batteries, underwater drones, mine-laying capacity, on the premise that the Strait of Hormuz represented a contested environment where Iranian assets could impose costs on any American force attempting to project power through the choke point. The footage of an unmanned American surface vessel sailing into an Iranian shipyard without encountering resistance is the visual record of how thoroughly that premise has been operationally falsified. The contested maritime environment that the IRGC built its deterrence doctrine around is no longer contested. It is dominated. The underground missile city footage released by the IRGC itself, intended as a demonstration of surviving capability, actually communicated something the regime did not intend. The footage showed ballistic missiles launching from what appeared to be a featureless desert surface, then revealed that the launch point was an underground silo, the missile rising from concealed infrastructure that sealed itself after launch. The intended message was, our remaining launch capacity cannot be targeted because you cannot see it. The unintended message was something quite different. The IRGC is showing footage of its most protected, most deeply buried capability because it is the only capability it has left to show. The mobile transporter erector launchers that gave Iranian ballistic missile forces their first-generation survivability have been systematically hunted and destroyed. The surface infrastructure that supported the missile program is gone. What remains is the underground architecture, which is exactly what Trump was describing when he said, very low-cost military options exist to ensure it remains buried underground forever. An underground infrastructure, however hardened, does not last indefinitely against weapon systems that were specifically designed to reach it. Kharg Island's Western oil export facilities have now been struck directly for the first time. Pumping stations, key pipelines feeding the terminal, the infrastructure that connects Iran's oil reserves to the tankers that were supposed to carry them to Chinese markets. This is not the same as striking the island's airstrip, which was hit in the opening phase. This is the commercial infrastructure of the Islamic Republic's primary revenue source being physically damaged, combined with the water pumping stations struck in Khuzestan province, the stations that connect Bushehr to the provincial water supply. The campaign is now reaching the infrastructure that sustains civilian and commercial functions, not just military ones. Trump said publicly he would prefer not to target water infrastructure. The fact that it is being targeted communicates that the preference has limits, and those limits have been reached. Now let's put the confirmed operational numbers on the record. Saudi Arabia has conducted its first direct offensive military action of this conflict, striking Sana'a International Airport in Yemen and forcing the diversion of an Iranian commercial flight carrying IRGC personnel. The Houthis have launched missiles toward Aba International Airport in southwestern Saudi Arabia near the Yemeni border. Interception status confirmed. Impact status unconfirmed at the time of this report. Iran has launched at least 4 ballistic missiles toward Jordan, targeting what are believed to be American military bases in the country. All 4 were intercepted by Jordanian air defense systems. Bahrain has activated air defense systems against multiple aerial attacks from Iran, ballistic missiles and drones with several intercepts confirmed. Kuwait has engaged hostile aerial targets in its airspace. Bandar Abbas has been struck again. Kharg Island oil infrastructure hit for the first time. Pumping stations and key export pipeline infrastructure. Water pumping stations in Khuzestan province struck, affecting the water supply connecting Bushehr to the rest of the province. U.S. naval attack drones have eliminated IRGC shipyard capacity. And President Trump addressed reporters this week and confirmed that the regime's own security forces have killed 52,000 Iranian protesters over the course of this conflict. 52,000. While journalists asked why the Iranian population is not rising up in the streets, Trump's answer was direct. Nobody is going to protest when they get shot. They have machine guns aimed at people's heads. If you move 1 foot further, you get shot. That figure, 52,000 killed, is the answer to every question about why the population of 88 million is not visibly in open revolt. The question itself contains its own answer once you understand the number. Now let's look at the 3 simultaneous pressure tracks that have converged in the past 24 hours, because the convergence today is categorically different from anything that has preceded it in this conflict. The regional coalition track is no longer theoretical. 3 months ago, the coalition consisted of the United States and Israel. Then Gulf state facilities were opened for American operations. Then Kuwait began firing HIMARS from its territory. Today, Saudi Arabia has conducted offensive strikes in Yemen. The Arab world, the Sunni majority states that the IRGC spent 4 decades trying to destabilize, subvert, and surround through its proxy network, has collectively moved from passive host to active participant. The encirclement of Iran that the IRGC always described as American imperialism has become a regional coalition built not by American pressure, but by IRGC missile strikes on the neighbors those countries share. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia did not need to be convinced to enter this fight. It needed a trigger that cleared the political threshold. The regime's continued use of Houthi infrastructure and its use of civilian aircraft to transport IRGC personnel into the theater provided that trigger. The economic destruction track has reached the irreversible phase with today's combination of Kharg Island infrastructure damage and the formal reimposition of the Hormuz Blockade with a commercial fee structure attached. Iran's oil revenue was already zero because commercial shipping had stopped transiting. The Kharg Island pumping infrastructure being physically damaged means the pathway to resuming oil exports cannot be restored by a diplomatic agreement alone. It requires physical reconstruction of destroyed infrastructure under conditions of active conflict. The 20% levy Trump has attached to the Guardian role means that even when commercial transit resumes, every cargo shipment through the strait will be generating revenue for the American naval presence that enforces the passage. The Islamic Republic has not just lost its oil revenue, it has lost the infrastructure that generated that revenue. Rebuilding both simultaneously in a post-conflict environment that would require international investment to reconstruct is a challenge of a scale and duration that no previous Iranian government has faced. The proxy dismantlement track is the one that reveals the depth of the American strategic planning that the ceasefire period concealed. It is now visible in retrospect that the pause in direct strikes on Iran was coordinated with an acceleration of the campaign to eliminate the regime's external military assets. Hezbollah in Lebanon reduced to operational irrelevance, Hamas in Gaza neutralized as military force, IRGC militia networks in Iraq being rolled up, and now Saudi Arabia entering Yemen to push the Houthis out of their operational zone with Yemeni government backing and American air cover. The Islamic Republic's strategic doctrine for the past 4 decades was built on a specific and explicit premise. Even if Iran itself came under attack, it could activate its proxy network and threaten regional destabilization at a scope and scale that would make the cost of attacking Iran prohibitive. The proxy network was not a collection of organizations the regime happened to fund. It was the structural deterrent that was supposed to make Iran untouchable. Attack Iran and you activate Hezbollah on Israel's northern border, Houthi missiles on Saudi and Gulf oil infrastructure, IRGC militia targeting American forces in Iraq, and ballistic missiles closing the strait, simultaneously across the entire region. No American administration, the theory held, would be willing to absorb those costs at once. That theory has been operationally falsified at every level. The proxies were eliminated before the main theater resumed. The ceasefire was the operational window in which that elimination proceeded. And the IRGC is now fighting the direct military conflict without the deterrent network that was supposed to make this fight impossible. Now let's go inside the regime's institutional response, because what the IRGC has produced this week as its official public communications tells you more about its condition than any battle damage assessment. The IRGC's Khatam al-Anbiya headquarters issued a formal statement threatening the United States and demanding it cease interference in the region. The statement was delivered by an AI-generated spokesman, an artificial avatar that does not blink, moves with the constrained animation of a character that has been insufficiently trained on human movement, and delivers threats against the world's dominant military power with the affect of a video game cutscene. The Islamic Republic of Iran, which once commanded the attention of global strategic planners, is now issuing its official military communiques through a digital character that cannot blink. This is not a minor detail about production quality. It is a symptom of an institution that has lost the human capital required to maintain even the performative dimensions of military authority. The people who used to stand at those podiums are, as the raw intelligence picture has suggested for weeks, either dead, wounded, or in bunkers that they cannot leave without becoming targets. The kill list, the IRGC's targeting roster for proxy and cartel-connected assassination operations, has been updated and expanded. The IRGC newspaper published the images of its targets this week, dressed in prison uniforms, with the caption, "Revenge is inevitable." The list has expanded beyond American officials. It now includes Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Secretary Hegseth, Secretary of State Rubio, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, French President Emmanuel Macron, and outgoing British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The expansion of the list to include European heads of government is both operationally significant and strategically revealing. Operationally, it communicates that the regime's proxy networks are being directed towards softer targets in countries with less hardened security infrastructure than the United States. Strategically, it communicates that the regime has concluded it cannot successfully target those at the top of its list, and is expanding downward to those more accessible. A kill list that expands is not a list that is succeeding. It is a list that is failing and broadening its aperture in response to those failures. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson said this week that Iran will not grant the IAEA access to its nuclear facilities and will not allow the Strait of Hormuz to become a platform for threatening Iran's national security. Both of those things are currently happening, while the Foreign Ministry says they will not allow it. The IAEA question is moot, because the American position is that verification does not require IAEA inspectors. The GBU 57 is the inspection mechanism. The Strait question is equally moot because the American Navy is already there, already serving as the guardian of the passage, already generating the 20% levy on cargo transit. The Foreign Ministry is issuing statements about a reality that has already superseded every condition those statements were designed to prevent. They are describing a world that stopped existing before the statements were written. The United Kingdom's designation of the IRGC as a proscribed terrorist organization under its new National Security Act is the final piece of the international institutional framework being assembled around the regime. The UK has documented IRGC activities on British soil. Unit 840 operations targeting Iranian British journalists, cyber operations against critical infrastructure across multiple allied nations, criminal gang networks doing the regime's bidding in British territory. The British Home Secretary confirmed that in January 2024, the UK sanctioned Iranian officials responsible for threats to kill on British soil, and that Iranian cyber proxy actors affiliated with the IRGC have targeted US critical infrastructure sectors, alongside Australian, Canadian, and British organizations. The designation is not merely symbolic. It criminalizes support for the IRGC in Britain, creates legal exposure for individuals who have been operating as propagandists and facilitators for the regime in the UK, and formally aligns British law with the American and Israeli position that the IRGC is not a state military institution, entitled to the protections of that status, but a designated terrorist organization operating under state cover. This took 47 years. The regime that was established in 1979 has been designated a terrorist organization by one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council in its 47th year of existence. The international community's patience with the Islamic Republic, its willingness to treat it as a legitimate government capable of normal diplomatic engagement, has not just eroded. It has been formally and legally terminated by the country that once treated engagement as the only viable policy. The significance of the UK designation cannot be measured only by its domestic legal effect. It is a signal from one of the world's most significant intelligence and security services, GCHQ, MI6, MI5, that the institutional assessment of the IRGC has reached a threshold that requires legal action rather than continued monitoring and diplomatic management. When the British security apparatus reaches that conclusion and encodes it in statute, it means the intelligence picture they are working from has become too severe and too operationally active to treat as a matter for diplomats. The kill list the regime has now published, its targeting roster for proxy and cartel-connected assassination operations, distributed through its newspaper with photographs of targets dressed in prison uniforms and the caption, "Revenge is inevitable," has expanded to 6 countries and now includes heads of government of NATO member states. This is not a list that an institution publishes when it believes it can execute the operations it is advertising. This is a list that an institution publishes when it wants its domestic audience to believe it retains the capability to threaten its enemies, because the domestic audience cannot see the operational picture that tells a very different story. The prison uniforms and the graphic are revealing in a different way than the IRGC intended. They describe what the regime wishes for its enemies, but in the context of a conflict where the regime is losing everything it possesses, the image of world leaders in prison garb says more about the fantasies of a failing institution than about any realistic operational plan. The strategic picture as of July 11th, 2026 looks like this. Saudi Arabia is in the theater. The Strait of Hormuz is under American guardianship with a commercial fee structure attached. Kharg Island oil infrastructure is damaged. 52,000 Iranian protesters have been killed by their own government. The IRGC communicates through AI avatars. The kill list has expanded to 6 countries. The UK has designated the IRGC a terrorist organization. The proxy network that was supposed to deter this moment has been systematically dismantled. The supreme leader has not been publicly seen in 135 days. The conventional army has evacuated its headquarters. The underground missile cities are showing their launch footage because nothing else is left to show. And somewhere over the Hejaz, the Houthis are now launching missiles toward Abha Airport in southwestern Saudi Arabia. The kingdom's answer is still in the air, the interceptors racing upward, the outcome of this newest escalation still unresolved as of this writing. The Houthis fired at Saudi Arabia for the same reason the IRGC fires at every country within range. Because firing is what they know how to do, and because the alternative to firing is acknowledging that the war they have been fighting for 7 years in service of a patron that is collapsing has ended in a way that produces nothing for them except ruins. But the Houthis in 2026 are not the Houthis of 2022. They are fighting simultaneously against Yemeni government forces with Saudi backing, against direct Saudi airstrikes on their infrastructure, and against a supply chain from Iran that has been severed by the same campaign that is destroying the regime in Tehran. A Houthi that cannot be resupplied, cannot be reinforced, and whose sponsor state is being dismantled in real time, is a Houthi on a descending operational trajectory regardless of how many missiles it manages to fire before the trajectory bottoms out. Return to the Mahan Air aircraft, the Iranian commercial jet that took off from Tehran carrying IRGC members towards Sana'a International Airport, only to find the runway destroyed and the landing impossible. On board, passengers chanting death to Israel, curses upon the Jews, death to Saudi Arabia, chanting at 30,000 feet while their destination burned below them. Redirected to Hudaydah, landing in a secondary port city instead of the theater they were being transported to. Alive, but not where they intended to go, their chants continuing while the geography of their plans evaporated beneath the Saudi strikes that made their intended runway unusable. That aircraft is the metaphor the regime cannot escape. The chants continue. The destinations keep disappearing. The runways keep burning before they can land. The proxy networks they were flying to reinforce are being dismantled by forces the regime once believed it had neutered through its deterrence architecture. And the kingdom that they spent 4 decades trying to encircle has just decided it is done watching from the perimeter, has entered the theater, and is now the air power over Yemen that the IRGC always counted on being able to threaten without consequence. The war now has a new and irreversible geometry. Saudi Arabia is fully on the board. The Strait of Hormuz is under American commercial guardianship, with a 20% levy attached to every cargo ship that transits it. The proxy network is being systematically dismantled theater by theater, and the IRGC, the institution that built this entire architecture of deterrence over 47 years, is on the wrong side of every angle that geometry now produces.